Today I had absolutely no idea on what to record, so I'm just going to make a part 2 to my last video. Let's start. Good morning first, I hope you're doing very well today. My name is Janek Ernst, and like I said, this is the part 2 of drawing plants and vegetation. So today we're going to draw two trees, which are the baobab trees, the big ones in Africa, and also the bonsai trees, which you often see on maybe like houseplants and stuff like that. So this video is going to probably be shorter than the last one, but I hope you guys won't mind. Also, thank you guys so much for support on my last two videos and my last shorts. So thank you very much again, and let's start. Okay, so we have my program, which is again Open Canvas 7. You can get it on Steam, and I will say that every single time when we're starting. Okay, let's go. First up, we're going to draw the baobab tree, which is pretty simple, but let's go over the basics and we're going to draw that. Okay, first of all, the thing with baobab trees is that they are very wide and very tall. And this makes it pretty easy to draw because you don't have to focus on the branches, on the leaves or something like that. But you have to remember this. Let's first start. So I'm going to start out at the bottom. And I'm going to make the bottom look kind of like maybe some kind of dome. And this will be our foundation for the tree. And I'm also going to make some small spots for the roots. Now this is important because baobab trees have pretty big roots that just go out the ground and kind of go down like this. Okay, so we have this finished. And now let's just finish this one, the general trunk, which, like I said, is going to be pretty tall and just very simple to do because it's pretty straightforward. You just draw a big shape and there you go, you have half of the tree completed. But we need to still draw the upper side. And this is also pretty easy. You can do this by just drawing curvy lines like this, and you have basically mapped out your, let's say, direction on which where the branches go. And also, I didn't mention that in the last video, but I was going to mention that today. Very good way to determine where your branches are going is to draw some guidelines like this. And then from those guidelines, you are just basically able to make branches that go out in a pretty planned and straightforward pattern. Okay, so we have those branches finished. And as you can see, I followed my guidelines like this, and now let's say the branches look pretty good. And you can always do this. You can use this in every tree, in every single way possible. You don't have to use this specifically for baobab trees. Those just aren't reserved for that. You can use them every time. And now we're getting into the pretty easy part, drawing the leaves. Like I said in the last video, just random lines like this. And the fun thing about baobab trees is that they don't have that much of them, so you don't have to really focus on them that much. Okay, so we have the leaves finished. And now I am going to kind of cut them out from the branches so that they actually look like the branches are going into the leaves and not the opposite way. And why am I doing that? Because in real life, the branches look like this. You have branches that just go into the tree itself, or for example hiding in the leaves, and this isn't the other way. You don't have trees that, for example, have branches that just go into outside the leaves. Sometimes they can do that because you have a lot of branches and, for example, a small amount of leaves, but generally you're going to see trees that are just branches that are just going to hide in the leaves. Okay, so we have that finished. And now let's draw the texture of the tree. And why am I doing that? This is because baobab trees are very big and very wide, and you're going to see that even if you shade every single thing in this. So a very good way to get your tree to come to life and just have some texture, let's say. You can do that by drawing simple lines like this on the branches also, and also in some spots you can do little circles, just kind of form out and go out like that. Let's make one also here so that it looks a bit better. Okay, so we have this finished, and now since our whole tree is just basically done right now, let's just shade it. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to choose which parts of the leaves I want to make the darkest. So let's say both of those, because they are pretty hiding in the back. And also some of those, so that we can make our branches stood out, so that our drawing doesn't look like there is just a bunch of lines that don't really mean anything. Okay, so this is done. And also I'm going to draw some small spots like this and shade them in like this. And now our tree is basically starting to come to life. So let's make our darkest spots even darker so that it stands out really well. And also let's make some of the spots a bit darker, but not too much. Okay, so that looks good. And while we are doing that, we can also darken our outline of the leaves a little bit in the places that the outline isn't very, let's say, well seen. That is good. And now, what about the trunk, the general shape? Well, our source of light is, let's say, here, and we can confirm that by the general shape and the direction of the shading. So let's say this sun is like somewhere right there. So we're going to shade this side right here. And this is because the light source is just going at this tree, so we don't have this side lit up. So I am going to, first of all, mark my area where I wanted to darken. And let's do this basically. Let's just shade the tree. And also, I also didn't mention that, but I'm going to say that in this video once again. When you're shading, my advice would be to make a couple of layers of that shading. This is because the gradient is so much easier to do when you're doing a couple of layers instead of just doing something like this, where you have this line and you have to, for example, redo it a couple of times to make it look a bit better. But when you're doing something like that, when you just, for example, make layer 1, 2, 3, and 4, you end up with a tree that is split up into a couple of gradients, and that looks pretty nice. Okay, so this side is shaded, and now what about the roots? The roots are pretty straightforward. You just kind of darken them a little bit. Okay, that looks nice. And also those ones that just stick up to the ground, let's make them darker where they make contact with the ground. And this one I am going to also shade the darkest because this is just blocking the view. And this one I'm going to make the lightest so that it doesn't really stand out. Okay, and what about the branches here? This branch right there I can shade the same way as I shaded the whole trunk. And that is because this branch catches the eye the most. So you can just do it like this. And also, if you're not satisfied with the end result of, for example, your branch and your leaves, let's say, for example, that this is the darkest area and this is the lightest area and they meet, you can always do something like this, when you just, for example, darken the area where your tree meets the branch, when your leaves meet the branch, I'm sorry. And yeah, that looks nice. And then what about this 4? Let's make the barriers, maybe let's say, where they, for example, start a little bit darker so that they look like are actually growing out of the tree. And since this one is like directly blocking the view of the sun, I am going to shade it one shade of gray. That looks nice. And this one I'm just going to do the same thing as I did here and here. But this time I'm going to leave one side white. With this branch I'm going to do the same thing, with one difference being that this one I just left no white basically, and here the place that those two branches meet I'm going to make the darkest so that it really stood out. And what about this guy right here? Let's make this area a little bit darker and leave out the rest. And now look at that, we have our baobab tree shaded pretty well, but what about the general shadow of the whole tree? We're going to do it basically the same way we did last video. Just going to do some lines and just shade them in. If you want to, you could also do something like this, where your tree is, for example, your trunk is shaded as a whole, like this, okay? And then you, for example, want to draw the leaves on the shading. You can do that by doing a simple guideline. Let's make it right here, on where your leaves are, and then basically just detailing them in a little bit and filling them in. Okay, so our baobab tree is basically done. We have everything. We have the trunk, which is very wide. You always need to remember that. We have the roots that just go out into the ground. We have the leaves, which are pretty small and pretty basic. And we have the shade. So, since this is done, I'm going to go on to the next part, which is the bonsai tree. Okay, so now the bonsai tree. Now, the thing is with those trees that they have massive roots that just go out into the ground basically everywhere. And since I'm starting off with that, I'm going to draw the roots like this. I'm gonna do a very wide base, and let's just throw in a couple of lines like right here to indicate where are two main ones and two main roots. You can also use a simple technique, like I showed you, with the branches to indicate where your roots are. Right here, let's say. Let's make this one a little bit wider. Right here, and let's say right there. Okay, so we have our roots, and let's end them. Let's just disconnect them from the ground. Okay, so the roots are done. You always need to remember that there's a lot of them, and just they go out into the ground. Now, when it comes to the trunk and the branches, they are always pretty curved, so we're going to curve them like this. We're going to make it like something like that, this line, and then I'm going to also make a second end that's going right there. So I'm going to make a little angle here, what's going here, the main trunk, and the second one that is going right there. Okay, so those two trunks are done basically. And now when it comes to the branches, let's use the same technique and draw a couple of them. Now, depending on the tree, the bonsai tree to be exact, there is going to be either a very big amount of branches or a very small amount of them. I'm going to make like a pretty small amount, because this video would take a lot longer to make if I wanted to do, for example, a lot of them. So let's just make a couple of them. Now, a quick tip: when you're drawing branches, you don't always have to make them single, let's say, wideness, because branches are very your natural branches are very like unorganized. Sometimes they can just bend like that. So when you're drawing branches, you don't always need to make them the same shape as you started, like I'm doing here. You can see that I am just basically covering my guidelines very randomly. And this is fine because just branches don't always have to be perfect. They can sometimes go out in a very weird pattern. They can also sometimes be pretty small. Okay, so we have this finished. And now when it comes to the leaves, I am also going to draw some circles that indicate where I want my main like pile of leaves be. Okay, so we have those finished, and as you can see, those are very like flat. And this is because same thing as the baobab tree. You have a lot of leaves that just are packed in a very small, let's say, space. And this time there's a lot of them, so we're just going to follow those guidelines kind of and draw the leaves. Now, sometimes your leaves are going to interfere with each other, so I'm going to make this one stand out, and this one right here, I'm going to make it look like as if it's a little bit behind this one, and here, I'm going to make it look like it's at the front. Okay, so we have 3 piles of leaves, and this one is the farthest away, and this one is the closest. And now with these ones, I'm just going to follow my guidelines like this. Okay, so I finished my guidelines and I finished drawing my leaves. And now, like I did just a second ago, I'm going to just make our branches look like they're hiding in the leaves in places that they just, for example, look like they are actually going into the leaves. Notice how I'm, for example, not doing that in here and here, and this is because those are drawn like they're actually indicating that the leaves are hiding. I don't have to, for example, draw barriers when they are hiding like there. Okay, so we have everything finished, and before I'm going to do the shading, I'm going to erase my guidelines so that my drawing looks a bit cleaner. Okay, so I erased my guidelines, and since I am done with that, let's go on to the shading. So, I'm going to pick out some spots that are going to be the darkest, like I do always. Okay, we have those spots picked up, and let's just shade them in. And this one I'm going to make the darkest, and I'm going to shade the whole leaves. And that is because this is the one that's the farthest away, so that it doesn't really needs to be this much, let's say, shaded. Also, as we're doing that, I'm also going to show you a simple thing to make your branches and leaves look a bit better. You can sometimes do something like this, where you have a line of shade that just follows at the very bottom. And it makes like your leaves have a little bit of depth in them. This is a good tip if you're drawing, for example, something to make it look like it's actually 3D. And you can also sometimes do something like this, where you have multiple layers of that. Okay, so our leaves are finished. And now, since our direction is going pretty much like this, I'm going to do the source of light, let's say somewhere right there. And since this is right here, I am going to shade this part. But before we do that, let's make our texture of the tree, of the wood. This is pretty important when drawing trees, because when you're drawing something big like this, your tree is pretty much very visible to everyone, and the parts that are not shaded are just going to stand really out if you don't have anything drawn like that. You don't have to do this every single time. When, for example, you draw casually or just sketching or something, you don't have to always do that because you don't really pay attention to that. But if you're doing something that you want to look a bit more professional and a bit more, let's say, well made, you always need to remember about the texturing. Okay, so we have this finished, and now let's go on to the shading, and like I did last time, I'm going to do a couple of layers of that. Okay, so our main trunk is complete, and notice how I made this part a little bit lighter than this one. And this is because this part is curved so much that it gets a little bit less light than here. So our shade is going to be basically a bit darker, and it looks just more natural. So let's go on to this one. At this one, I'm going to do a pretty similar way, just shading it like that, but I'm going to make it a little bit lighter, because this part also receives a little bit of light. And let's go on to the roots before we do the branches. This one I'm going to make the darkest because it's just hiding in the tree, and also the shade is affecting that. So let's just make this one like that. This one I'm going to also make one single, let's say, line, but a little bit lighter, okay? And this one, let's do that like this. We pick a pretty light shade of gray, and then we map out our, let's say, border where it just meets the ground and the shade like that. I'm also going to make this part a bit darker. Okay, maybe not that much, but okay, like this, so that we really see where the roots are. And I'm going to make a simple gradient, not too complicated. Okay, so that is done. Let's go on to this one. And this one I'm not going to shade the whole thing like this, I'm just going to make one side. And this side I'm going to make a little bit darker, just a tiny bit. And here I'm just basically doing something like this, when I make it look like it has depth of some sort. And this one I'm going to basically shade only this part, so that it actually looks like it's on the ground. Okay, so this is done, and now let's go on to the branches. This branch I'm going to make the same color as those leaves, because those are connected to the leaves and this is just hiding in there. This one I'm going to make it a pretty similar way that we did the trunk, but this time I'm going to also darken out the areas where the branch is just hiding. And here I'm going to do something like this. This one I'm going to shade all of it. That is because even though the leaves are just visible, the branch isn't really. It's just hiding behind the leaves. And these ones I'm going to do a similar thing, but this time, let's say we have this one, and it's just hiding like this. And here I'm going to make it a shade of gray like that, so that it looks like we have a lot of leaves also in the back. Alright, so this is done, and what about the shade here? So I'm going to make a simple line right there, okay? And then basically just outline where my shade is going. Okay, so that looks nice, and as I said, you can always do something like this. Let's map out where our branches, trunks, like this one, go. Let's make it so that it goes somewhere right there. Okay, let's darken it like that. And also, let's make our guidelines on where our piles of leaves are. Okay, and now let's just detail them in a bit. Okay, so we have those, and let's just shade them here, like that. Alright, so our bonsai tree is pretty much done. I know this shade looks like it's a bit more angled than it should be, but that's okay, we're not drawing like professionals, we're just learning. And, okay, since this is done, I'm going to do the same thing, like I do always, and make the final drawing. For the final drawing, I'm going to make a big bonsai, and this time I'm going to shade it a bit more professionally, and I'm also going to trace over it. So I am going to make my trunk with you guys, so that you see how this process goes. So for example, let's make it a very wide one. Let's make those roots just stick into the ground like this. Let's make a couple of them, okay? Right, and since we have the roots, but they look like they're just holding the tree up, I'm also going to make something like this where it looks like our just roots go from up and not the other way around. Okay, so that is done. I'm going to follow the pretty similar shape as we did just a second ago, like this. So I'm going to map out where my basically trunk is going to be. Oh, there we go. Okay, that looks nice. And now the branches. Okay, and since I have everything mapped out and just the whole basic shape is done, I'm not going to waste your time and just draw everything and explain what I'm doing because we did that just a minute ago. So enjoy the time lapse. Alright, so I finished my drawing and we can see that I also traced it so that it looks a bit cleaner, and I used all the techniques. I did a bit of texturing, you don't really see that, but I did, don't worry. I also added some shade leaves, leaf shade, I'm sorry, which you can see that it just pops out right there, and some of them are a bit darker so that they look like they're behind the tree. I also made the same thing as I did before. The part that curves out the most gets the least amount of light so that it looks like more natural. And I did a pretty simple shadow, and this is because I don't really have the motivation to just basically map out the entire, let's say, leaf area. So yeah, this is basically our bonsai tree I finished, and I think concludes our today's video. Alright, so this is basically the finish of today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe because this helps out with the channel a lot. And also make sure to leave out ideas for maybe future videos in the comment section. I am always happy to read them, and I'll make sure to integrate them with other videos. So yeah, Yannick is out. Peace.